Well, good morning, everybody. As Kaylee said, I'm Sarah Peterson. I'm one of the managing directors at Clear Sustainability, and I'm also a legal advisor with Digital Infrastructure Advisors Limited. I'm a London-based UK-US regulatory attorney and sustainability policy advisor. I'm really excited to be here with you guys to share my thoughts from a legal perspective on the role of regulations in shaping the future of the data center industry. So, as you can see from the slide, I've posed the question of what does Luke, Leia, Han Solo, and Chewbacca have in common with the data center industry? On a recent podcast I was on, I made an analogy between a scene from the movie Star Wars and the current state of the data center industry under the incoming regulations. Some of you who are of my age will remember a scene from Star Wars where Princess Leia, Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Chewbacca are stuck in a trash compactor, and the walls are closing in, and there's a monster lurking underneath the water, waiting to make Luke Skywalker that evening's dinner. And I feel that is really representative of what the data center industry is facing with these new incoming sustainability and ESG regulations. On one hand, you have all of the regulations that are coming in the EU and in the US and globally. On the other hand, you have the economic factors such as investor expectations, you have customer demands, you have supply chain costs and expenses that are putting pressure on the data center industry. And lurking underneath both of these walls is the legal monster that is ready to hold the data center industry accountable for their actions. So, how did we get to where we're at today as an industry? A lot of this started back in December 2015 when 196 nations adopted the Paris Agreement, which is an international treaty on climate change. The goal of this treaty is to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And then building on to the Paris Agreement, in 2019, the European Union adopted the European Union Green Deal. This is their roadmap to becoming the first climate neutral continent by 2015. And it's also the roadmap that they are using to grow their economy while decoupling from resource use and depletion. Also, some other factors that have influenced where the data center industry is currently is the Data Center Code of Conduct and the ISO standard on environmental impact and energy efficiency. So, since the adoption of the Paris Agreement and the EU Green Deal, regulatory requirements have begun. Sorry, I haven't been shifting my slide, so I'll try to remember to do that. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement and the EU Green Deal, regulatory requirements have been shifting away from being imposed on the international community and now are becoming legal requirements on the business community. In recent years across the globe, we have seen the regulations that we are talking about in this presentation implemented with the goal of holding businesses accountable for their social and environmental impact. The regulations I'm going to talk about today are just a few that are going to be affecting the data center industry as a whole in the coming years. The first one we'll talk about is the Energy Efficiency Directive, the EED. So the EED was adopted from the Data Center Code of Conduct, and some argue that the reason it was adopted and made into a regulation is that the industry as a whole was very slow in moving towards adopting energy efficiency practices. The first reports under the EED were submitted this past September 15th, and moving forward in 2025, reports will be due on May 15th. The goal of the EED is to promote energy efficiency while reducing energy consumption. And if you are a data center operator that has a total energy of 500 kilowatts or more, you will be required to file reports under this directive. This also will apply to non-EU data center operators. So it seems like the most talked about regulation that is going to be facing the data center industry is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. Under this directive, companies will need to look at their total assets, their net turnovers, the number of employees they have to determine whether or not they will be required to report under the CSRD and in what year their reporting requirements will begin. Companies that do fall in within the scope of the CSRD will have to disclose information on how their business strategies will impact sustainability factors. They will have to report from a double materiality standpoint, meaning that they will have to show how their business activities are affecting social and environmental factors. And then likewise, they will have to show how various sustainability matters are affecting their company as a whole. One of the interesting aspects of the CSRD is the fact that a lot of companies have made net zero have set net zero goals or have submitted net zero numbers. And under the CSRD, you will be able to do the net zero and you'll be able to submit net zero numbers, but you will first have to submit your gross emissions numbers. And then in a separate section, you will have to identify if you used carbon credits to reach those net zero emissions. And I think that's going to have a fundamental effect in companies being able to reach their net zero goals moving forward. The next regulation that I actually think is going to have the biggest impact on businesses, and we have not talked about it enough, is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. This regulation applies to large EU companies and as well as non-EU companies doing business in the EU market. Under this directive, companies will have to conduct due diligence in its own business operations and that throughout their value chain to assess and identify any negative social and environmental impacts. If you are a larger company and you have identified in your supply chain that there is a negative social or an environmental impact that cannot be prevented or mitigated, you will have to, one, cease and desist with all operations with that company, or you will have to help, if it's a smaller company, financially help them to mitigate any negative social or environmental impacts, or provide training to them and their staff to help prevent that. Another interesting aspect of the CSDDD is that companies will be required to address climate change risk by aligning their business strategies with the Paris Agreement in the goal of limiting temperature warming to 1.5. Under the CSDDD, a duty of care is being introduced for directors and executive of companies, making them accountable for ensuring that their companies meet the due diligence and climate obligations of the CSDDD. Under the CSDDD, it's also interesting because this is the first directive that mandates member states implement a mechanism for enforcement of non-compliance. This includes things like penalties, sanctions, administrative actions. Another interesting aspect of the CSDDD is this is the first directive that allows third parties to bring actions against companies for environmental or social impacts. So if you are, say, a Congolese artisanal miner and you are impacted under a human rights issue, you now under this directive have the ability to bring a legal action against a company. So moving away from the EU and into the US, we'll start in California and move eastward. This past September, Governor Newsom signed into law Senate Bill 219, which is a combination of Senate Bill 253, which is the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, which requires that companies who are doing $1 billion in revenue and business in California to report on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This report will be required starting in 2026. And Senate Bill 219 also includes Senate Bill 261, which is the Climate related financial disclosure. And this applies to companies that are doing $500 million in business in revenue and doing business in California to file biennially a climate-related financial risk disclosure. They will have to, in the report, address any risk, climate-related risk they've identified, and then measures they've adopted to reduce and adapt to climate-related financial risk. This report will need to be published on a company's website, and it will be due beginning in 2026. Likewise, to the California regulation, New York has also adopted similar requirements in regards to a company's revenue, and the reporting requirements for GHG and climate-related financial risk. One of the laws that everybody's been talking about since March is the SEC Climate Disclosure Rule. And as much as I'd love to talk about it, I feel at this time, really put a pin in it and let's visit this in the next couple months, because we had an election in the US last week, and I think it's prudent to wait to see what this new administration is going to do. There's been a lot of talk that the new administration coming in will not require any climate financial disclosures moving forward. That's yet to be seen. So until we have more information, I don't think it's valuable at this time to talk about it. So we'll see what the new administration does when they take office in January. Interestingly enough, Canada has become the most recent country to announce that they will amend their Canadian Business Corporation Act to require large federally incorporated businesses to provide climate-related financial disclosures. At this stage, we don't know how big the companies will be, the size of the companies that will be required to report, or what they will be required to report on. We do know that small and medium enterprises will not be required to report under this. So as an industry, we spend a lot of time talking about what the reports need to include, and the metrics that need to be used, and the information that needs to be put into the reports that will be submitted to the reporting bodies. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about the risks of the information that we are putting into these reports, and the risks that we as an industry are exposing ourselves to. So I want to talk about 6 different potential risks that we need to focus on and identify and think about when we are preparing reports that will be submitted to these regulatory agencies. The first one is regulatory penalties, fines, and administrative action. Considering most of these regulations have not come online yet, and the EED is the only one that has had a reporting deadline, it's hard to know what penalties or administrative actions we may or may not face. We could get a good idea by looking at other industry-specific climate regulations that have been implemented to see how it's been handled and what type of fines that they have incurred. But we have yet to know what the industry as a whole will face until we actually start having to submit some of our reports. Another area for concern in the area of risk is increased litigation in the area of shareholder lawsuits, board of director liabilities, consumer or public interest litigation, supply chain accountability. I want to highlight 2 cases that will give an example of shareholder lawsuit and board of director liabilities. Most recently, in the area of shareholder litigation, 3 NGOs and 8 individuals filed a case requesting a prosecutor open a criminal investigation against Total Energy's shareholders for claims of endangering the lives of others, becoming involved in involuntary manslaughter, neglect to address disasters and biodiversity damage. They want to use the shareholders' voting records to hold them criminally liable for these actions. So any shareholder who has voted for climate strategies in opposition to the Paris Agreement should be held, in their opinion and under their allegations, should be held criminally liable for their actions. The other case I want to talk about is Client Earth versus Shell. This was a case that was brought against the board of directors of Shell for failing to implement policies that would enable the company to meet the goals of their energy transition strategy. This case was dismissed by the UK High Court, but despite the fact that it was dismissed, it's a great example of how regulatory agencies, shareholders, and activists are pushing for more transparency. And from that transparency, they are pushing for proactive efforts from companies to mitigate climate impacts. This case also shows that if the perceived effort does not match the performance by the company, the pursuing parties are willing to hold board of director members accountable for their actions or their lack thereof. Another area of risk is in reputational damage, such as negative publicity. Data centers in Northern Virginia have been feeling the heat of negative publicity for the last several months, as environmentalists like Julie Bolthouse have been campaigning against the expansion of data centers in the area. Ms. Bolthouse and her group have been focusing on the negative effects of data centers on the demand, their extra demand of water, the effects of their backup diesel generators on the air quality, the burden and pressure that are being placed on taxpayers to pay for electricity upgrades for the data center industry. So we need to be aware and work on negating the negative publicity that we face as an industry moving forward. Other areas of potential risk is lack of investor confidence, loss of access to capital and investment, difficulty securing funding from banks or financial institutions. With more regulatory reporting, we're going to have increased scrutiny and oversight, and then be prepared for long-term liability and social harms. So what are some legal concerns that we need to be aware of as an industry? Legal obligations for environmental and social impacts. The key thing that we as an industry need to keep in mind is that these regulatory reports carry with them the obligation to ensure that the data, both created internally and received from our supply chain, is complete and accurate. It's the responsibility of the reporting entity to ensure we have done our due diligence, both when it comes to environmental and social impacts. And if not, we're going to be held legally accountable for that. We need to ensure that our contracts are drafted in a way that the sustainability clauses are enforceable. I can tell you that the current contract methodologies do not have mechanisms in place to handle this requirement. Current sustainability clauses are drafted to be not drafted to be associated with the subject matter of the actual contract. So therefore, a sustainability clause can be breached, but not affect the contract at all. And so moving forward, we need to be more cognizant of ensuring that our sustainability clauses are drafted with a specific intent, drafted with a grant of a specific right or obligation, and have identified specific parties or a party that these sustainability clauses apply to. An area that I think is going to get really interesting in the area of law is tort v. contract. An important aspect of enforceability is understanding how regulations like the CSDDD is blending tort and contract law into a new hybrid type of law. This is murky. This is going to be a murky area moving forward because it is regulations like the CSDDD are bringing together two legal concepts that normally are separate. You either are dealing with a contract issue or you're dealing with a tort issue, but under the CSDDD, you're bringing two legal concepts under one umbrella. So it's going to be interesting to see how that one evolves. Extraterritorial jurisdictional reach is another area which is going to create some challenges for businesses, because how do you create, the challenge is going to be in how laws and regulations in one country are applied to companies in another country. A company in one country could comply with their own laws, but be in violation of laws that are implemented in the EU. So it'll be interesting to see how companies are able to navigate that legal risk in complying with both international laws across the globe. Value chain liability is going to be another area that needs to be addressed, and it's important for companies to understand the downstream implications of the reports they provide from EPDs or LCAs, as they will form the basis for companies that report moving forward. If these reports are inaccurate and the downstream customer is cited for it, these consequences could move back up the value chain through legal actions. And then finally, the implication for investors. Just as companies must ensure the accuracy of the information of their reports, investors must ensure that their portfolio companies have accurately accounted for environmental and social impacts. How many private equity firms have the expertise to assess these reports to ensure that the information aligns with the business, aligns with the investment thesis, especially if they have green funds? As we're coming to the end of this presentation, what do companies and investors need to do moving forward? We've covered a lot of ground over the last few slides and brought up several challenges that companies will be facing in the years ahead. This presentation has only just scratched the surface, but there are things that we could start doing now to prepare as an industry. First and foremost, we need to recognize that sustainability is no longer an aspirational or optional goal. It is now a regulatory requirement where accuracy and transparency are paramount, and it should become a company-wide effort. Regardless of whether or not your company meets the reporting threshold, you are probably in a value chain of a company that is required to report, and you will need to report to them. Furthermore, while these companies carry the responsibility of doing proper supply chain due diligence, you could face liability for inaccuracy or incomplete reports. I strongly advise companies to engage third-party sustainability experts to help assess regulatory compliance. My firm has seen a lot of corporate ESG and sustainability reports that under the microscope of the CSRD or the CSDDD would be deemed incorrect and even potentially greenwashing. Definitely, it would be a benefit to engage an outside expert to help companies identify potential issues before it becomes a regulatory issue. I think that PE firms should definitely, PE and investment firms should start making sustainability due diligence part of their overall due diligence as they are assessing whether to engage in a transaction. The last thing you want is to have a lawsuit brought against you for greenwashing or for inaccurate claims. And finally, you need to bring your attorneys into the sustainability discussion. Corporate counsels need to engage attorneys that are experts in sustainability to ensure all external contracts, transaction, and governance policies are in line with these new regulations. In closing, I'll say that there was a lot of excitement in the industry this past fall when the UK government gave the data center industry the designation of being a critical national infrastructure. The data center industry as a whole has always taken great pride in self-regulation, but we as an industry now need to understand that we stand at the cusp of becoming a regulated industry, and we need to ensure that the regulations adopted support and grow this industry. So we as an industry need to begin engaging with policymakers at all levels of government and begin to tell our story and begin to engage and develop the regulations that help our industry as a whole. And with that, I will open the discussion up. If there's anybody who has any questions, I'm happy to share any insight.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that, Sarah. That was really interesting, and for shedding some clarity on a subject where I think there's still quite a lot of uncertainty. I'm going to move us straight over to questions because I think we've got quite a few coming in, and I'm going to try and get in as many as we can. So the first one, this has come up a few times over the last few days. I wondered if you had any insight on how you see the regulatory environment changing in Europe, especially in the wake of a potential trade war with the new Trump presidency.
I actually don't think the Trump presidency is going to have any effect on the regulatory environment in the EU. And the reason I say that is because the EU has come out so quick and so fast and has implemented some very strong regulations that I don't think that the Trump administration is going to be able to have any effect on them, on what's going on here. And I will say, aside from the fact that Trump is coming in January, there's already been conversations in the US and in the US House of Representatives and in the US Senate regarding the effects of EU regulations. It's already been a topic of conversation, and the US hasn't affected what's been going on in the EU. So I don't perceive there being any change going forward.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to ask the next one in stages because it's a 4-part question.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so first of all, what are the implications of data centers being classified as critical national infrastructure according to the UK government?
What do I think the implications are?
Yeah.
When I first heard about the fact that the data center industry was going to receive this designation, the first thing that came to mind was, when any time a government comes to you and says, and Ronald Reagan said this back in the 1980s, if a government comes to you and says, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, they're never really here to help. The government's not here to help, and there's going to be strings attached to the CNI designation. And I think the thing that people need to be concerned about is what is going to be the requirement moving forward for the CNI? Is the government going to want to have access to your customer information and the data that you store in your data center industry? If you are just a data center that houses TikToks versus I'm a data center that houses medical records, well, if we're in a matter of crisis, which data center is most important to keep online? The one that houses medical records or the one that houses TikToks? Well, the only way you're going to know that is if the government has access to the information that's being stored. So I think there needs to be some concern with what is the UK government going to want to know about your data center beyond just power usage and just beyond the critical raw materials and beyond the MEPs, and what are they going to want to know from you to actually give you that designation? And I could go off on a soapbox on this one because I think there's a lot of tentacles to it, but I won't do that because it's a 4-part question. So I'll entertain the other 3 parts.
Thank you. And then what do you think is the main regulation in the UK when concerning data centers?
Wow. I'll be honest with you. Like I said before, I think the CSDDD is going to be one of the big ones that affects the data center because it goes all throughout your supply chain, from what's inside of your data center, what makes up your data center. The CSDDD, despite the fact that it has a higher threshold for revenue and corporate size, it has a big reach because of the fact that you have to go all throughout your supply chain. I think that's going to be bigger than the CSDDD, and you have to do the climate as well as the due diligence for your negative impacts on social and environmental. Be prepared for the CSDDD is mine.
Thank you. And sort of carrying on from that, the next part is, as the UK is not in the European Union, will the EED still affect the UK?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's perfect. And then just is it true that next year, 2025, is sort of going to be a guideline for data centers going forward?
What's meant by what do they mean by guideline?
I think it means sort of like it's going to define what happens in the regulatory space in the data center sector over the next few years, next 5 to 10 years, I would say.
Okay, so that's a tough one because
Yeah.
we'll need to get the reports for the EED, which have already been
Mhm.
filed. You still need to have the CSRD reports filed. And then you have the CSDDD and the reports that will need to be filed under that. I don't think next year is going to be the defining year.
Mhm.
I think it's actually going to be more 18 to 24 months.
Yeah.
Because as the regulatory bodies have said in regard to the CSRD, right now they're just collecting information. They haven't
Yeah.
said what they're going to do with the information. They're just collecting information. And
Mhm.
again, it's never good when a government entity is collecting information.
Mhm.
They don't just
Yeah.
collect information just for light reading in the evenings. They're going to do something with it. We just don't know what, and we don't know when. And I think it's, like I said, 18 to 24 months. I don't think it'll be next year. I think
Yeah.
we've got some time.
So this sort of thing always does take time, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay, moving on to the next question. As the old saying goes, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. Rather than just the scary legal ramifications, should governments be doing more to incentivize people to make the switch? To sustainability, more sustainable operations.
So I'm going to turn the question around. Actually, I think the data center industry needs to be doing more with the government and
Mhm.
giving more honey to the government. I think we need to start engaging. As I've told people, I used to, when I was living in the US, I was a lobbyist in Washington and in Austin. And the individuals, the policymakers that are making the rules and laws right now don't know what we do. They don't understand our industry. They don't know how our industry works. And we need to start engaging with them. We need to tell them how our industry works with the energy markets, how our industry works in communities,
Mhm.
how our industry can benefit the community. We need to start giving the positive spin. We need to start advocating for ourselves and not waiting for the government to come to us. Because by the time the government comes to us, they've already got a plan in mind of what they want to do.
Thank you. And I'm just gonna, if I can, just squeeze one more in before
Yeah.
I let you off the hook. Excuse me. Given the oncoming requirements across Europe regarding reporting, why are so many data centers not measuring, reporting on key metrics? For example, water usage over the past 3 or 4 years, we have seen year on year fall in numbers in terms of measuring and reporting on water.
Boy, I think I mean, that's a hard one
Yeah.
because every data center has its own reason. I think one of the main factors is there's been such a high demand for data centers.
Hmm.
They're just so busy blowing and going and
Yep.
constructing that they're not it, sustainability reporting, all of it, we'll get to that. We'll get to that when
Yeah.
we're done. We've got, a demand for 500 megawatts and 1,000,000 megawatts. I mean, I'm being exaggeratory there, but it's every time we turn around, we're reading where there is a new, bigger, better data center coming online. And so everybody's just so busy in growth mode
Hmm.
that all the reporting factors, I think, until it comes down and they're held accountable and held liable in their feet are held to the fire, you're not going to see, um, I don't think, an excitement to
Yeah.
report because they're busy building, not
There's
reporting.
there's too much going on at the moment.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was an absolutely fantastic way to start the day. That was really insightful. So thank you for joining us and giving us your time this morning.
Thank you guys. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye bye,
Bye
Sarah.
bye.